And then Casey attended an IARC training, that's the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is based in Lyon, France. And she attended a training on coding and staging in December 2017. So she's now one of our regional trainers, which means that she can provide training for the Caribbean region in the area of coding and staging. And she has very kindly agreed to run this webinar series for us. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Casey now. If there are any questions in terms of not able, well, if you can't hear, I'll write something in the chat now, but if you're not able to see the slides, or if there are any questions about the logistics of the presentation, there is also a chat. Please feel free to enter those questions in the chat, and either myself or Nkosi Husbands, who's the IT specialist at the IARC Caribbean Cancer Registry Hub based at CARFA as well, and he's going to be providing all the IT support for these webinar sessions. If there are any IT related questions in terms of hearing or seeing, please go ahead and type that in the chat, or anywhere that you can find the question answer part is fine as well, and either Nkosi or myself will try to contact you to try and sort that out without interrupting the webinar series. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started right away. I'm going to hand over the mic to Casey. And Casey, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Nkosi Felix, and I'm the research officer at the Dr. Elizabeth Kwamina Cancer Registry, which is the National Cancer Registry of Trinidad and Tobago. And this morning, I will be introducing you to the coding system that is used within cancer registries, which is known as the International Classification of Diseases for Oncology, in particular, the 3rd edition. I first would like to acknowledge Ms. April Fritz for all her contributions to cancer coding and registrar training over the years. She unfortunately passed away in 2017, but most of the slides in this presentation, which was provided to me from IARC, is courtesy of April. So let's begin. What is ICDO? ICDO is a subset of the International Classification of Diseases, which is used by all countries, usually to code mortality data. ICD-O, which the O stands for oncology, is a specific subset of codes and diagnoses in ICD-10 dealing with neoplasms. So ICD-O is a reference book for coding not only cancers, but other malignancies, such as leukemias and lymphomas, as well as benign conditions and conditions in between, which is called borderline tumors. ICD-O 3 has been developed by a working party convened by IARC and the World Health Organization. And the morphology codes for the neoplasms have been revised, especially for lymphomas and leukemias. ICD-O describes two aspects of any neoplasm. First, the code tells where the primary site is. That is where the cancer started. And then the code also tells what particular cell became neoplastic. This would be a new concept for anyone who's familiar with coding in ICD-10. So why they decided to develop ICD-O? It standardizes the data collections within the cancer registries. It groups cases with similar concepts, that is site of origin, the type of cancer. It conveys the information quickly, and it provides easier retrieval for research, as well as facilitating comparability of the data. Okay, so how is ICD-O different from ICD-10? First of all, it's different in how it's organized. Secondly, it's different in its level of detail. And thirdly, it contains special codes. So first, we're going to talk about the differences in organization. So ICD-10 is organized firstly by behavior, then by anatomic site involved, and morphology codes are optional. While ICD-O is organized firstly by the anatomical site involved, and then by the morphology and the behavior of the cells. So this table here just kind of giving you an idea of the differences we see between ICD-10 and ICD-O. As can be seen with the ICD-10 codes, the behavior and anatomic site is what the codes are grouped by. This is not the case with ICDO. In ICDO, behavior is the 5th character in the morphology code, but we will explore that a little further later on. So looking at the organization differences. So here on this table, we're looking at this example, and we can see that the code used for colon is different in ICD-10 based on the behavior of the neoplasm of the colon. However, in ICD-03, all of the neoplasms listed will be coded using C18, which is the code for the anatomical site involved, which is colon. Okay, one of the main problems with how ICD-10 is organized is that ICD-10 can't tell the difference between a small cell lung cancer and a squamous cell lung cancer. And this information is very important for deciding treatment and further research. So now we move on to the level of detail, right? In ICD-10, it utilizes single axis coding, which looks at the behavior and anatomic site only. However, ICD-O is much more detailed. It utilizes dual axis coding, where we look at the anatomic site alongside the cell type and behavior of the cancer. So here, once again, we have a coding example. In ICD-10, you would notice the codes are all based on the behavior of the lung tumor and less about the all based on the behavior of the lung tumor. In ICD-O, you would see the code differs. All the first part of the codes remain the same because it's the same site, and the only change is the 5th digit of the morphology code, which changes according to the behavior of the tumor. Okay, moving on to the third difference, so special codes. Some special codes were added into ICD-O, and some of the codes in ICD-10 were not used, while some of the codes were used differently. As we continue along, this will be explained in more detail. Right? So some of the special site codes we see in ICD-O are for the hematopoietic and reticuloendothelial systems, such as blood, bone marrow. And in ICD-O, we would use the primary site for leukemia as bone marrow, for multiple myeloma, also bone marrow C42-1, and for Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia, we would use C42-0, which is the primary site blood. There are some ICD-10 codes that are not used in ICD-O, and these are the histology-specific ICD-10 codes, right? So instead, anatomic site codes are used to dictate the site, and a separate code called the morphology code will dictate the type of cell and behavior of the cancer. So therefore, as we see on the slide here, for melanoma of the skin, we will use C44, which is primary site skin. And for mesothelioma, we'd use C38.4. Kaposi sarcoma, once again, C44 skin. And for all the lymphomas and for all the leukemias, we use C42-1, which is bone marrow. And for lymphomas, we usually would use C77, which is for these primary site lymph nodes. In some cases, we would use different codes, but once again, we will explain that further a little later on. Some more ICD-10 codes that are not used in ICD-O are the examples we see on the slide. In ICD-10, C26-1 is spleen. However, in ICD-O, we'd use C42.2. The C77 to C79, which represents secondary malignant neoplasms of other specified sites. In ICD-O, we only code the primary site, right? And in ICD-10, C97, which represents malignant neoplasm of independent multiple primary sites. In ICD-O, we code each primary site separately. Okay, some errata and updates for ICD-03. Before we begin, just some history of the book. ICD-03 was sent to the printer in June 2000. The first errata was published in May 2001. The second errata was published in January 2003. And then there was updates that was done September 2011. If you currently go on the site though, you will be able to download an updated book, which is called the first revision off of the website, and a second revision should be available soon. Okay, now we would look at the structure and format of the ICD-03 book. Now the ICD-03 book will become basically your best friend while you work in a cancer registry. It's always good to have it handy because it's very important in the work that we do. Right, so within the book, you would see different sections with different ICD-0 codes. So right, where we would start from in the book, you would see the first section would start with topography, which is the site of origin, right? But starting on page 8 of the book, the ICD-0 coding rules describes the structure of the code in two parts, right? The where is it, which is the topography, and the what is it, which is the morphology, right? Basically, the topography is the organ in which the tumor started, and the morphology will be the cell type, and with the morphology will describe the cell type and how it behaves. All right, so the book format is as follows. We have the introduction first, which is then followed by the coding guidelines. Then we have the tabular, which is the numeric list for topography and morphology, followed by the alphabetic list, which is basically topology and morphology together, but in alphabetical order. This is then followed by the appendices, and finally the errata, which is separate documents from the book, right? It's probably, if you have the physical book and not the PDF on your computer, it's a good suggestion to use the purple ribbon that the book comes with as a bound for the middle of the book, where it has a summary of the grades and the different grades and of the cancers. Because while you're coding, you would always more than likely have to flip back to there. The alphabetic index is the largest section of the book. Okay, the topography, which is the numerical list, it begins on page 45 in the hard copy and page 33 on the PDF, right? The structure of the codes within the numerical list, it's a 4-character alphanumeric code, right? It starts with C and is followed by 3 digits. The 2 digits before the period indicates the organ or system, and the digit following the period indicates the subsite. So in this example here, C00.4 is the code for lip, mucosa of the lower lip, right? And 00 would indicate the organ, which is the lip, and the 4 after the period would determine where on the lip the tumor arises, aka the subsite of the lip, which would be the lower portion. These numerical lists range from C00.0 to C80.9. And it's grouped by systems / common organs, and it, as I explained before, it is in numerical order. So the major topography groups of the numerical list as follows. C00 to 14 is the lip, oral cavity, and pharynx. C15 to 26 is the digestive organs. C30 to 39 is respiratory system. C40 to 41 are bones, joints, and cartilage. C44 is skin. C47, nerves. C49, soft tissues. C50, breasts. 51 to 58 would be the female genital organs. C60 to 63 would be the male genital organs. C64 to 68 is urinary tract. C69 to 72 are eye, brain, and CNS. C73 to 75 are thyroid and endocrine glands. C76 are all other ill-defined sites. C77, lymph nodes, and C80 will be unknown primaries. So like right now, if you have the book, it would be helpful probably if it is you just flip to the numerical list, or even if you have a physical book, just to follow along. As I said, it's on page 45, right? So as you see the numerical list, you would notice that the preferred terms are in boldface, right? While the synonyms are indented. Equivalent terms are not indented, right? Now these equivalent terms would be a subdivision of the preferred term, but it was not sufficiently different to warrant its own code. So the example we have here is C07, which is the parotid gland, right? As you can see, the preferred term, which is parotid gland, is in boldface. And parotid, not otherwise specified, is indented because it's a synonym, right? Below that, we would see Stenson duct, which is considered an equivalent term, right? It's a subdivision of the parotid gland, but it's not sufficiently different to warrant its own code. Parotid gland duct is a synonym for Stenson duct, so therefore it's indented. Okay, the morphology numerical list begins right after the topography numerical list comes to an end. As you can see here, it's on page 69 of the hard copy, 53 of the PDF, right? So the structure of the morphology code is the first 4 digits would describe the cell type, which is the histology of the cancer. And the 5th digit would describe the behavior. For example, neoplasm malignant would be 8000/3. The 8000 would represent the code for the histology of a general neoplasm, and malignant and behavior code is 3. These codes range from 8000/0 to 9989/3, and is grouped by common cell types, and just like the topography, is in numerical order. The major morphology groups are as follows. 800 is unspecified, 801 to 867 are carcinomas, 872 to 879 are melanomas, 880 to 899 are sarcomas, 906 to 909 germ cell tumors, 938 to 948 are gliomas, 959 to 972 are lymphomas, 980 to 994 are leukemias, right? So very much like the previous topography, once again, the preferred terms are in boldface and the synonyms are indented. Equivalent terms are not indented. Once again, the equivalent term is a subdivision of the preferred term, not sufficiently different to warrant its own code. For example, combined small cell carcinoma, we see mixed small cell carcinoma is the synonym which is indented, and all the other subdivisions that were not sufficiently different to warrant their own code are not indented. Now we talk about the obsolete terms. As you look through the book when you're doing your searches, every now and then you may come upon a code that has OBS in square brackets next to it, right? What this means is that that code is an obsolete term. It's meant to discourage the use of a term for a new diagnosis when a better diagnostic term is available, right? But it's useful for reviewing historic data. So you do include the obsolete codes in the registry, even though the terminology is out of date. And here we see an example of bronchial adenoma cylindroid. We see that term is actually an obsolete term. As we go along the book, this is where I was telling you it would be useful to put the purple ribbon marker if you have the physical book, which is page 66. It's located, the behavior and grade differentiation are located on the pages between the numerical, topography, and morphology lists, right? And it's useful to place the purple ribbon here for quick reference because you will always have need to refer to this page. The behavior is the 5th digit after the slash of the morphology code. The behavior code indicates the pathologic behavior of the neoplasm, aka if it's benign, in situ, or malignant. Most registries in the world only collect cancer with behavior codes 2 and 3. The grade or slash, or otherwise known as differentiation, is the 6th digit after the slash of the morphology code. It is the last digit in the 6-digit morphology code, and it describes how much or little a tumor resembles the normal tissue from which it arose, right? It's very important that you always code to the grade of the primary tumor, because sometimes when you're abstracting, you would notice the pathologist would actually give the grade of the metastasis. At that point, you don't use that grade, you only code the grade of the primary tumor, if it is available. Right? Pathologists use different grade systems for certain sites. They describe the tumor grades by level of similarity. Example, the 2-grade system that they use for colon cancer, or the 3-grade system they use for prostate, bladder, and fallopian tube. So this is just a screen grab of how the page looks in the on the PDF, which is the digital copy of ICD-03. Usually in the book, these two things are on 2 separate pages. So here we have the full ICD-03 code, which is a 10-digit code. We have 4 digits for the topography, which is the where is it, and 6 digits for the morphology, behavior, and grade, which is the what is it. Altogether, 10 digits.
Apologies. And Casey, can I interrupt for 1 second?
No problem.
There's, I should have mentioned it in the introduction, my apologies. In the webinar schedule that was shared previously, we included the reference material that you'd need for each of the sessions. So I'm just going to put in the chat what that was, so you can reference it in the chat, what it was for this session, and that's the ICD-0 manual. It's available online, or if you go to that link, you'll also see the option where you can purchase the book. So there's just a couple of questions that came in about the book that you're referencing. So I've included it in the chat. So please go to the chat to see the link. You can see the online version. I believe you can download the PDF version from this link as well. Is that right, Casey?
The codes that from IARC?
Yes.
No, that would only give you access to like an online
version.
An online version. But if you just were to Google ICD-03 PDF, you're able to get a link to download it.
Okay, I'm going to share that as well in the chat as well.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, no problem. Okay, guys, so now we're going to go a little bit further into the alphabetic index, which follows the numerical list to the front of the book. So in the alphabetic index, the topography, which is the C codes, and the morphology, which are the M terms, are listed together alphabetically but not mixed. There's usually a space before or after each group. A boldface header for any word that appears as part of 3 or more terms. A boldface header is for any word that appears as part of 3 or more terms, and the terms are indented, right? Not NOS terms are listed first. NOS stands for not otherwise specified. So here we have an example of adamantinoma. We see that it's because it's a word that is part of 3 or more terms, you see that word is bold. And then we have all the other terms below related to adamantinoma is indented. As I just mentioned, NOS means not otherwise specified. It's printed after a term when it lacks a modifying or more explicit word or phrase. If it contains an adjective that's not listed, and if the word is just being used in a general sense. For example, a pathology report that just states adenocarcinoma, we would code that as adenocarcinoma, not otherwise specified. So in the alphabetic index, we have tumor-like lesions that are included. Now, these are not neoplasms, and usually you would see they don't have a code and just have C SNOMED in brackets, right? Terms are usually listed under both the noun and the adjective in the alphabetic index. For example, if you see a pathology report that states lobular carcinoma, you will be able to find it under C for carcinoma, as well as under L for lobular, right? This is for all cancers except for lymphomas and leukemias, which are only listed once. So after the alphabetic index, we have the appendices, right? And the appendices contains the new ICD-03 codes, because before ICD-03, there was an ICD-02, and new codes were added from when the book was published in the third edition. It also has all the new terms and synonyms, right? From codes that were in ICD-02, terms that change morphology codes, terms that change from tumor-like lesions to neoplasms, deleted terms, and terms that change behavior code. So it would be useful when you first looking through your book, that you just kind of glance through the appendices to get an idea of the changes that would have occurred. And actually right now, because there is a first revision, that is a version that you would find online, that same site that Sarah would have posted in the chat, you would see they actually have a part where they just have all the updates, because in the first revision, they updated some codes from when they published the book in 2000. So the first revision has even more updated codes and so on. Okay, so the rules. Now, it's very important for all cancer registries to understand the rules that come with the ICD-0 coding. This is to ensure that, that all cancers that you will collect would be coded correctly, right? There are coding guidelines for topography as well as for morphology. So some of the general coding guidelines for topography, right? We will code the site in which the primary tumor originated, even if it extends to adjacent subsite. So it's very important that once it is that the tumor starts at a particular site, that you code it to that site. Even if the tumor had started at that site and grew to an adjacent subsite, you still code it to the site where the tumor originated, right? You will code to subsite 0.9 for single primaries when multiple tumors arise in different subsites of the same anatomic site. So for example, an infiltrating duct carcinoma of the upper outer quadrant of the right breast and an infiltrating duct carcinoma of the lower inner quadrant of the right breast. These sites are the same anatomic site, which is the right breast, but they are not adjacent and they exist in two different subsites. So therefore, you would code that C59. Right. So if a tumor is metastatic and the primary site is unknown, you have to code the primary site to C89, which is an unknown primary site. The topographic site of a neoplasm may be described using a noun or its related adjective. For example, glioma of the pons or pontine glioma, right? If it is, sometimes when it's explained like that, you may find the term pons in the alphabetic index to code pons, but you may not find the word pontine. So it's very important as well to know that, okay, if you find an adjective on a pathology sheet, to know what is the related noun, to see if the related noun is in the book. If the medical record does not contain enough information to quote a site, you would consult a physician advisor if it is available, or you would use not otherwise specified for the organ system or the ill-defined site code, right? If there's no information at all on the primary site, you would have to code on to unknown, which is C89. So there are 5 topography rules, right? We will go into detail about these rules in a little bit, right? But these are what all the rules basically state. Rule A is about topographic regions and ill-defined sites. Rule B is about prefixes. Rule C is about tumors involving more than one topographic category or subcategory. Rule D is for topography codes for lymphoma, and Rule E is topography codes for leukemias. There are also 5 morphology rules. Now we will go into detail with this next week at the other webinar, but this is just an introduction of what the rules look like, right? The Rule F deals with behavior code and morphology. Rule G is for grading or differentiation. Rule H is for site-associated morphology terms. Rule J is for compound morphology diagnoses, and Rule K is for coding multiple morphology terms. Now we're going to go into detail about the rules relating to topography. So the first rule, Rule A, looks at topographic regions and ill-defined sites, right? And it states that if the diagnosis does not specify the tissue of origin, use the appropriate tissue suggested in the alphabetic index for each ill-defined site in preference of the not otherwise specified category, right? An ill-defined site is a term for the area of the body used in a general sense, such as arm, ankle, face. If it is you see just the term arm on a report, there are so many parts of the arm, it doesn't specify if it's the skin, if it's the muscle, if it's connective tissue, whatnot. That's what I mean. It's because it's just used in a general sense. So, for example, if the pathology report states osteosarcoma of the ankle, there are several non-specific codes available to you. There's the ill-defined site code, which is C76.5, which is ankle, not otherwise specified. There's a code for the bone of the ankle, C40.3, the skin of the ankle, C44.7, and the soft tissue of the ankle, C49.2. So in this case, we use what we have available to try to code as specific as possible, trying to avoid using the ill-defined site code, right? Because the ill-defined site code is just general, it's not otherwise specified. So we use the information from the cell type to code to the primary site, because we know an osteosarcoma, osteo refers to the bone, so therefore we use the code C40.3, bone of the ankle. What is also useful in certain cases is that when you have a specific morphology like this as well, we'll go into it more next week, but just to mention, when you are using CanReg 5, it would also flag things like that because the program is actually built into the program, so that should help you out as well. Okay, this is another example. We have a malignant carcinoma of the arm. We have noticed further information on where on the arm or what part of the arm. But we would know that carcinoma is a cancer that arises from the epithelial tissue of the skin or lining of the internal organs, right? So based on that information that we know, we would code it to C44.6, which is skin of upper limb, because we would know a carcinoma arises from the type of cell a carcinoma would arise from. So, and like basically summarizing, the implied rule here is to code as specifically as you can with the information you have and avoid using ill-defined site codes if possible. Like, it's only if it is you really have no information, you just have this general term and it have no other way of knowing where, we would have to use the ill-defined site code. So now we go on to Rule B. Rule B states that if a topographic site is modified by a prefix, such as peri, para, or something along those lines, which is not specifically listed in the ICD-0, you're coding to the appropriate ill-defined subcategory, which is the ill-defined site codes, unless the type of tumor indicates an origin from a particular tissue, right? So this applies to terms. Terms that describe a non-specific area such as pre, peri, para, supra, infra, area, of, region of. And sometimes you come upon a lot of these kind of terms in pathology reports. So it's also important though, before you code it to the ill-defined site code, you have to check the alphabetic index to ensure that the term with the prefix is not listed, because sometimes some of these terms are listed in the alphabetic index of the book. So, for example, periampullary is C24.1, periadrenal or perirenal C48.0, retrocecal, peripancreatic C48.0, supratentorial brain C71.0. So basically, when you're coding, the first call of action is to look up in the alphabetic index to see if it is you see a code for the term. Once you see these prefixes, if there's no code for the term, then you would have to use the ill-defined site code, right? So when the term is not listed, you determine the location it describes and you code to that. So, for example, you see in a medical record, it says paraspinal, which means beside the spine. You go to the alphabetic index, you click to P, you look and you don't see paraspinal. Then you code to the ill-defined site, which would be C76.7, which is ill-defined site at the back. Now, when it's just a helpful tip, when it is you are faced with something like that, it would be easier. You look in the alphabetic index first to see if you see the particular code, and if it is you don't see the term listed, it would be easier to just flip to the numerical list, and all the ill-defined site codes are under C76 because it will be in numerical order. So you go to 76 and then you look for the appropriate ill-defined site code by basing it on the part of the body where this ill-defined term is from. So in this case, it's beside the spine. So when you look through C76, you will see the most appropriate one would be the C76.7, which would include back flank trunk, not otherwise specified. Perigastric, around the stomach, right? So once again, you would look to see if it says you see perigastric in the alphabetic index. You will notice the term is not there. You go to the numerical list under C76 and you look for the appropriate part of the body. So gastric is, you would know, is in the abdomen. So you use the code for ill-defined site of the abdomen. Finally, peribiliary, which is around the biliary tract. Once again, you check the alphabetic index to see if you see this term listed. The term isn't listed, you go to the numerical index under C76, appropriate part of the body. Once again, C76.2, ill-defined site of the abdomen. So therefore, the implied rule here would be when you can't find a code for the anatomic site term, use the ill-defined site code, right? Do not code to the primary site mentioned, such as spine, stomach, or bile duct, when the term is described as near that organ. Once it's described as near, you would have to use the ill-defined site code, unless it is listed in the alphabetic index. Okay, so now we'll go to Rule C. Tumors involving more than one topographic category or subcategory, right? You use the subcategory 0.8 when a tumor overlaps the boundaries of two or more categories or subcategories and its point of origin cannot be determined. It's important to note that accessioning and multiple primary rules may differ from the ICD or coding, right? And we'll go into multiple primary rules in the last webinar of this session. So, perfect example to use for overlapping site is the breast, right? So, if you have a tumor of the breast at 12 o'clock, which is, just like on a clock, it would mean that's overlapping in, for example, of the right breast in the upper outer and the upper inner quadrants, you would use C58. Now, in this case, this is if you definitely cannot tell where the tumor originated, and it seems that it's just originated at that 12 o'clock point, which is the overlapping of two quadrants. Here you use 58.8. This would also include a glioma involving the parietal and a sophital lobes, a large neoplasm of descending and sigmoid colon, tumor of the hard palate and soft palate. Any tumor that's overlapping two sites, we code to 0.8. So we have an example here. Sarah's sister adenocarcinoma involving left ovary and fallopian tube. Now the code for the ovary is C56.9, and the code for fallopian tube would be C57.0. But this sister adenocarcinoma is overlapping on the two sides. So in this case, we'd have to code to C57.8, which is the code for overlapping lesions of the female genital tract. Then we have the mucosal carcinoma of the hard palate and the alveolar ridge, right? And then once again, we have two different codes, but it's overlapping. The mucosal carcinoma is overlapping the two sites. So therefore, we use the code for overlapping lesion of lip, oral cavity, and pharynx, which is C14.8. These overlapping codes in particular will be easiest to find in the numerical list because it's two different sites, and the numerical list would contain all the codes that you would see with the overlapping codes. It will be easiest to find in that list as opposed to trying to look for it in the alphabetical order, because in the alphabetical list you would find the codes for the two separate organs. And the reason why I would suggest the numerical list, because as you would notice, even though the codes for each different site in particular may be completely different, there would be set codes for overlapping lesions of, for example, the female genital tract or lip, oral cavity, and pharynx, and it would just be simpler to find in the numerical list. And prior to starting heavy coding, it might just be a good idea to look through and make notes. Maybe you could just make a list of these overlapping sites that you could probably just use as an exit in the book that you could have for quick reference when it is your coding. So the overlapping site codes are C02.8 for tongue, 08.8 for major salivary glands, C14.8 for lip, oral cavity, and pharynx, C28.8 for rectum, anus, and anal canal, C24.8 for biliary tract, C26.8 for digestive system, C57.8 for female genital organs, C63.8 for male genital organs. So therefore, the implied rule here is that if you can't tell where a single tumor started in an organ or system, you're using the overlapping site code. Now, very important to note, it does not apply to non-adjacent sites. So for example, squamous cell carcinoma of skin of the forehead and skin of the forearm, these are not adjacent sites. These are two completely different sites. You would use 0.9, right? And it also does not apply to separate lesions. If you have separate tumors in the upper inner and lower outer portion of the breast, you'd have to code the primary site as 50.9. We move on to rule D, which is the rule for how we code lymphoma sites, right? You code lymphomas arising in lymph nodes to C77, right? If multiple lymph node regions are involved, you code into C77.8. If no site is indicated for a nodal lymphoma, you code it to C77.9, which is lymph node not otherwise specified. Important to note, you're coding extranodal lymphomas to the site of origin, which may or may not be the site of biopsy, right? If no site is indicated for a lymphoma and it is suspected to be extranodal, we code it to C80.9, which is unknown primary site. So you're coding a lymphoma to C77 unless it's stated to be an extranodal or extralymphatic site. Some examples of extranodal lymphatic tissues are spleen, thymus gland, tonsils, Peyer's patches, lymphoid nodules of the appendix, and Walde's ring. Lymphomas occurring in specific organs are called extralymphatic and should be coded to the organ of origin, right? So that's stomach, small intestine, large intestine, brain, and breast, right? So it's very important, once again, you would always call a lymphoma to C77 unless it's stated to be extranodal or extralymphatic. So the special rule for with rule D is that involved lymph node chains do not have to be adjacent for you to code it to 8. This is just if there are lymphomas arising from more than one lymph node location, right? So for example, cervical and mediastinal nodes, C77-8, right? Axillary and periaortic nodes, still C77-8, and pre-auricular and occipital nodes. Now, this would be coded to C77-0 because both of these nodes arise in the head and neck area. So, these are just some examples of Rule D. A Hodgkin lymphoma of cervical lymph nodes, you code to C77-0. Mold lymphoma of the stomach. This is a lymphoma arising from a particular organ. So you code it to the stomach, right? B-cell lymphoma of the iliac and femoral nodes. Once again, the site doesn't have to be adjacent. We code it to C77-8 because this lymphoma is arising from 2 sites. And a primary lymphoma of the femur, once again, is arising from a particular organ. So in this case, you will code it to C42, which is coding it to the femur. Right? So basically, it's simple. Summarize here. You code the lymphoma to its site of origin. The final rule is looking at coding leukemia sites, right? We code all leukemias except for myeloid sarcoma to C42-1, which is the code for bone marrow, right? This is just a note here that myeloid sarcoma is a deposit of malignant myeloid cells in soft tissue, and you would code that to the location of the lesion. The following are also coded to bone marrow, C42-1. Multiple myeloma, refractory anemias, polycythemia vera, myelodysplastic syndrome, and other hematopoietic diseases. So I'm not sure how many of you all have the book, but for those of you all who have the book, this is just a exercise that kind of just solidify everything that you all would just explain, because if it's one thing with coding, the best thing to do to really understand everything is to practice. So here we have ascending colon. Everybody, so once again, we're looking at the code for ascending colon. The easiest way to do it right now is that you go in the alphabetic index to the back of the book and you look up C for colon. When you find colon within the alphabetic index, you would notice that it's a bold term because it has 3 or more terms related to it. And you just look under the word colon. Now you'll notice that everything under the bold term is in alphabetical order. However, NOS always appears first, which is not otherwise specified. So looking under the word colon in alphabetical order, you would notice yes, the code for ascending colon is C18.2. Moving on to axillary lymph node. Once again, using the alphabetic index, you just flip to L. And find the term lymph node. And then just look through all the different, there will be a lot listed, all the different codes for lymph nodes. Once again, looking in alphabetical order, you'll find the word auxiliary. And listed right next to it is the code for auxiliary lymph node, which would be C77.3. The upper or outer quadrant of the right breast. Now these codes for organs that they have 2 of them, it doesn't matter, it doesn't change to right or left, it would be the same code. So what it is, you would, once again, using the alphabetic index, you would flip to B and look for the term breast. Once again, you'll see not otherwise specified as the first term, but under that you'll see all the other areas in alphabetical order. UOQ is just an abbreviation for upper outer quadrant, and you will find the code listed under breast as C50.4. Then we see temporal and parietal lobes, one tumor. We know that these are parts of the brain. And as I said, it's easier to use a numerical list, but as also if it is, you just compile all the overlapping codes and have it as an insert in the book, you'll be able to quickly just refer to it and see that the code for this would be C71.8. Because C71 is the topography code for brain, and 0.8 is the code for used for overlapping sites. At this point, I'll just pause to see if it is we have any questions.
So far, the questions that have come in the Q&A part mainly dealt with where they could find the reference material. There's been a couple of questions about whether or not the presentation will be shared. I know these slides that NKC is using, they're an adaptation of the IOC prepared slides, so we just need to confirm that, I think, before we can share the materials. So we'll do that and confirm that with everybody. The session is also being recorded, and we plan to make that available as well. So we'll have to just confirm that we can share the material, and then we'd be happy to do that. Are there any other questions at this time for NKC before we move on? Please feel free to use the Q&A at this time. You're also free to use your mic. Nope, it doesn't look like there are. So you can go ahead,
Okay.
NKC.
Because as I keep explaining, one of the main important things about really absorbing everything with respect to coding is practice. So could the participant just indicate how many people have the book, because this next part you really would mostly benefit if you have the book to just like refer to.
You can either type in the chat, just confirm that you have access to an ICD-03 book. Again, you can download a PDF version, and I strongly recommend if you download the version that you have it printed in your office. You'll need a printed copy to do the coding. Okay, we have heard from Dr. Dos Santos, who said that BVI has access to the book. Can we hear from I think Bahamas, I know definitely has the book, Valerie and Miss Sweeting. There's Bermuda online as well, and Jamaica and Belize. Okay, so
some people have the book, so I'll just go ahead because
yeah.
How these presentations are set up is for explanation and then actual practice, right?
Okay.
So
just to comment on somebody indicated in the chat that we don't have the book, only what we downloaded and printed earlier. Just to confirm, did you download the PDF version of ICD-03? Because that is the book. That's what we're referring to. So if that's what you've downloaded and printed, then you have the book that you need. Okay, go ahead, and Casey.
Okay, so how these coding presentations are structured, it's set for that there's an explanation and then exercises, because as I said, it's very important to just practice so that you can have an idea of like hands-on how it is you actually use it. So what it is I'm just going to put up right now is a couple questions that I would like you all, I'll give you all like maybe 20 minutes to just do, and then we'll go through the answers. Okay? So everybody, you all are seeing the exercise here? Everybody seeing?
Yes, yes, we can see.
Okay, so I'll just pause here, give you all about 20 minutes to go through, and then we'll go through the answers together. And you all could feel free to ask any questions in the meanwhile, while you're doing it. Okay, so I'll see you all in 20 minutes.
Okay, great. So please go ahead and work. Now, in case we can see 11 questions. Is that
yes,
the
it's
total?
11.
Okay.
Yes, 11.
So please go ahead and work with these 11 questions and make notes of your responses. And then in case will walk you through coding them as a group. And we will check back with you at 10, let's say 10:15.
Yeah.
To see where you've reached. Hi, everyone. I'm just checking in to see how you are working through your 11 exercises. Does everybody need 5 more minutes, or a person's ready to get going? Somebody has provided all the answers for us in the chat. That's good. Okay, we just asked for okay, a few people just need 5 more minutes. So we will check back with everybody in 5 minutes and we'll get started to go through all the examples. Okay, it's now 21 past. And Casey, would you like to walk us through the answers?
Yes, no problem. So, since everybody's seeing the screen, I'll just kind of type it in here. Okay, so for number one, the site we have here is CCOM. This is pretty straightforward. You just use the alphabetic index. You go to C and you look it up. And you would see the code for CCOM is C18.0. Right? FEMA, same thing. Go to F, you look it up, and you would see the code for FEMA is C40.2. Right? Bone marrow, go to B and look it up. And we see the code for bone marrow is C42.1. Right? Esophagogastric junction. Now, the important lesson this site in particular taught me is very easy because it has so many bold-faced terms that you forget that the bold-faced terms are really just bold because there are 3 or more terms associated with it. However, there are terms that are not bold for sites that also exist in the index. So it might have been easy to overlook the code for esophagogastric junction, which is C16.0. You go to E and you look it up, and it's actually right above esophagus. It would be easy to miss it if it is you not looking for a bold, if you were looking for a bold face term, but because it just has esophagogastric junction associated with its code, the term is not bold, it's just in regular text. Then 5 is the cerebral meninges. Once again, using the alphabetic index, this is going to be your go-to for coding when you're coding all your cancers. Eventually, after a while, with the more common cancers, you would actually just probably remember the code offhand. But it's just always important to have this ICD-03 book on hand because you always need it. Remember, as I said during the presentation, how the terms could be found for like lobular carcinoma. You can find it under carcinoma and lobular. For cerebral meninges, you can find it under C for cerebral, and you would see the code is C70. Now, perigastric may have been a little bit tricky, right? But this is related to Rule B, which spoke about the prefixes, right? So in Rule B, as I was explaining, with the prefixes, first you would use the index to see if you find the term listed, and you would have looked at perigastric and noticed that it's not there. So therefore, you would have to code it as an ill-defined site. Now, once again, we know gastric is related to the abdomen. So therefore, the code for that would be C76.2. Right? Rule B. Number 7, which is for the auxiliary tail of the male breast. Now, the codes do not relate to gender. So therefore, the male was really just there to kind of throw you off. So you're just going to look up breast under B, and under breast you look up the code for the auxiliary tail, and you would see the code is C50.6. Right? Now, for number 8, which is a borderline cystadenocarcinoma overlapping the ovarian and fallopian tube, this question is related to Rule C, which spoke about tumors of more than one topographic category or subcategory. As you can see, that the tumor is overlapping both the ovary and the fallopian tube. The code for ovary is C56.9, and the code for fallopian tube would have been C57, right, .0. But since the tumor is overlapping, you would have to use the code for overlapping lesion of female genital tract, which is C57.8, right? Feel free to, as I'm going through the answers, if you all have any questions, to put questions in the chat, right? Then moving on to question 9, which is looking at lymph nodes of the axilla and scalene region, right? If it is, this is related to Rule D, which looks at coding of lymphomas, right? Now remember, we said that in lymphomas, there's a special rule that lymph node chains do not have to be adjacent, right? So in this case, the code for lymph node of the axilla is C77.3, and the code for lymph node of the scalene region is C77.0. So then, since it's a lymphoma that arises from 2 different lymph node chains, even if though they aren't adjacent, the code is C77.8, right? And that is Rule D. Number 10 is chronic myeloid leukemia. And this is related to Rule E, which was just basically, is one of the simplest rules, which states that for all leukemias, except for myeloid sarcoma, the topography should be bone marrow. So therefore, the code for chronic myeloid leukemia is C42.1, which was the same answer as number 3. Right? And finally, for rhabdomyosarcoma of the leg. So this is related to the first rule that we went through, right? Which stated that you code as specifically as you can with the information you have. Now, leg is a general term, right? So you don't know where in the leg. However, rhabdomyosarcoma is related, is a cancer that arises from a particular site, and it's you have the term sarcoma in it, right? So from the time you see sarcoma, if it is you actually go to leg in the alphabetic index, right? You would see, first you would see leg not otherwise specified with the ill-defined code, which is 76.5. But below that, you will see not otherwise specified, but if it's a carcinoma, melanoma, or nevus, you would code it C44.7 because you would know it's arising from the skin. And below that, you would see not otherwise specified, in brackets sarcoma / lipoma. And that would be coded to C49.2, which we know because we know it's a sarcoma. Right? And yeah, so those are all the answers. How did we do? Do you have any questions?
I haven't seen any typed in. Were there any that you wanted to query or that you'd like Casey to go over again?
And maybe too, if you all want, you could just put in the, if you all feel a little proud of how much you all got right, you could put how much you all got.
Yeah, feel free to tell us how much you got correct. I had a question about number 6. Why wasn't it coded to stomach? Not
because
specified.
If it is you would remember Rule B of the topography rules, stated for the prefixes that peri is a prefix that means near to.
Okay.
So let me just bring it back up. So you would see here for Rule B.
Right.
when it came to the prefixes, non-specific areas would include prefixes such as pre, peri, and para. So perigastric doesn't actually mean stomach, it just means like in the region of the stomach, which is a non-specific term, which would require that we decode it to the ill-defined site.
Okay.
Of C762.
We have a question. If you can please repeat number 11.
Okay, so number 11, which was rhabdomyosarcoma of the leg. Right, rhabdomyosarcoma of the leg. Right, so this is related, as I said, it's related to the first rule that we went through, which is where you refer rule A, which states that you code as specifically as you can with the information you have. Now, when it is you see something like this in a report, they just have the term leg, but it doesn't explain where on the leg. It doesn't say the skin of the leg, the bone of the leg, muscle of the leg. However, we would know that a rhabdomyosarcoma is a tumor that involves the striated muscle tissue. But more importantly, it has the word sarcoma in the morphology. And when you look up, if you go into the alphabetic index and you look up the term leg, you would see under leg, the first code is just for not otherwise specified, which would be C765, which is the ill-defined site code, as if it is, you have no other information. But below that, you would see they have the code C447, which would be if it's a carcinoma, a melanoma, or nevus, because we know those cancers would arise from the skin. Similarly, below that, you see C49.2, not otherwise specified, which is a code that is used for sarcomas and lipomas, because they arise from the muscle. So because we know rhabdomyosarcoma is a cancer of the muscle, we don't need to use the ill-defined site code. We could use a more specific code, which is for basically muscle tissue of the leg, C49.2.
Okay, a question came in. It says she got 8 correct. For question 11, found rhabdomyosarcoma under R in the alphabetical index and coded it to 8900/3.
Okay, so in that case, what you did, you coded the morphology, which is good. That's what we're going to do next week. But today we're coding just the topography, which is the site. So phrasing it as rhabdomyosarcoma of the leg was just really a way for you to get a understand that you could get a more specific site code than just using the ill-defined site code.
Yeah, and just to remember that the topography codes are ICD-10 codes, so they'll always begin with a C.
So in that case, like if it is you were coding the entire ICD-O code, which was including topography and morphology, you would have C49.2 and then 8900/3. So you were correct. That is correct, but that's the morphology code, and we were looking for the topography code.
There's another question. She says, I thought peri would mean around instead of just near to. That is why we use the one suggestive of around the stomach for question 6. Just a point here. Coding instructions related to ICD are extremely specific. So I would just recommend that you review the rules that NKC has gone through. Again, they're in the book that you downloaded. They're all detailed there. But so peri, as it relates to ICD coding, is going to be extremely specific. And that's outlined in that rule that NKC mentioned. Can you just bring up the rule again, NKC?
Yeah, but even in that case, whether it's around or near to, it's the same. It's the same because it's not the stomach. It's around the stomach or near to the stomach, which would mean that you have to code ill-defined.
Yeah.
Because there was no specific site.
Bahama says they got 10 out of 11. Excellent. And wow, question 6 great. Was the problem. Question 6 was tricky.
Yeah. And I think they just, the reason why they have a stickler to that is because they want the codes that when you code any cancer to be as specific as possible. So the issue might be that sometimes doctors or pathologists they're just writing, but like if for us now reading and abstracting, we can't take perigastric to mean the stomach. We have to take it for what it's stated as, which is a non-specific code.
Okay, and I think the other question in the Q&A section that most people had problems with was number 11, which you've gone through a couple of times.
Yeah, that was just, it was placed there just for that little bit of trickiness, because we're just focusing on how would we code that leg in such a, if it's just generally stated as leg with no specific area of the leg.
Are there any other questions, or would anybody else like further clarification for any of the exercises or for any of the topics that have been covered so far? There's another question in the Q&A about whether you'll get the completed, I think it's in the chat as well, whether you get the completed exercise in the email. Again, we just need to confirm these are IARC materials, whether we are free to share them with you. We're just awaiting confirmation from them. But again, the entire session is being recorded, and we hope to at least be able to share that. But we will confirm, hopefully within the next week, what materials can be shared. There's a question if you can quickly review rules B, C, and D.
Okay, no problem. Oops. Okay, everybody seeing PowerPoint, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so rule B, once again, it states that if a topographic site is modified by a prefix, such as peri, para, or the like, which is not specifically listed in the ICD-10 book, code to the appropriate ill-defined subcategory, which is one of the C76 codes, unless the type of tumor indicates origin from a particular tissue, right? So this applies to terms describing a non-specific area such as pre, peri, para, supra, infra, area of, region of. Now, because in all these cases, this is not indicating the specific site, it's just indicating like a non-specific area around the particular site, right? So once again, the examples, but this example here is showing that sometimes there are prefix terms that are listed in the index, right? So therefore, if you see peri and purulary, when you look up, go into the alphabetic index and you look up under P, you would find that term and you'll be able to code C20 for 1. Similarly, for periadrenal and perirenal, retrocecal and peripancreatic, supratentorial brain, right? These are all terms that you can find in the alphabetic index, and once you could find the term, you use the code that's listed. In the case when the term is not listed, you determine the location that it describes and code to that. So the example, once again, paraspinal, beside the spine, that term is not listed in the alphabetic index, so you will have to use the ill-defined site code. And if you go to the numerical index under C76, where all the ill-defined codes are listed, you will see that C76.7 would be the code that would be used, would be ill-defined site of the back, because that's the area in which is described to be, which is beside the spine, indefiled site of the back, indefiled site of the back. Perigastric, which is the example in the exercise, around the stomach. It's a non-specific code, a non-specific term. It's not listed in the alphabetic index. So once again, you would just look through all the ill-defined site codes and you would see that the most appropriate code is C76.2, ill-defined site of the stomach. Peribiliary, around the biliary tract, once again, not listed in the alphabetic index. You look through the ill-defined site codes, you know, the biliary tract is in the abdomen area. C76.2, which is the ill-defined site of the abdomen. And one thing you would notice in doing coding, especially as time goes along, if it is you are not versed in anatomy and physiology, it will definitely help you get back sharp at that, because you have to be really aware of like all the different sites and different things when it is you're coding. Right, so the implied rule here is that when you can't find a code for the anatomic site, you're using the ill-defined site, right? You do not quote a primary site mention, such as spine, stomach, or bile duct, when the term is described as near that organ, as in a non-specific term. So perigastric, even though you see gastric in there, because of the prefix, you have to code as an ill-defined site and not to the stomach. Going over rule C, which involve tumors involving more than one topographic category or subcategory, right? So you use the subcategory 0.8 when a tumor overlaps the boundaries of 2 or more categories or subcategories, and its point of origin cannot be determined, right? Once again, you note accessional and multiple primary rules may differ from the ICD coding. The overlapping sites, some common overlapping sites, like tumors you will find definitely of the breast. These are tumors that would arise at 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. You always code these to 0.8 because this is a tumor overlapping 2 subsites, right? A glioma involving the parietal and occipital lobes, once again, you're coding 71.8. Large neoplasm of the descending and sigmoid colon, you code to 0.8, 18.8 because it's overlapping. Tumor of the hard palate and soft palate, once again, you're coding to 0.8 because the tumor is overlapping 2 subsites. So the example here, Sarah's sister adenocarcinoma involving the left ovary and fallopian tube. We have 2 different codes, but the tumor is overlapping. Cannot determine where the tumor started. It's just overlapping 2 subsites, 2 different sites. So we code to overlapping lesion of the female genital tract, which is C57.8. Mucosal carcinoma of the hard palate and the alveolar ridge. Once again, we have 2 different sites. The tumor is overlapping. Cannot determine where the tumor started. It's overlapping 2 sites. We code to C14.8, which is an overlapping lesion of the lip, oral cavity, and pharynx. And these are basically a summary of the overlapping site codes. For tongue, 02.8, major salivary gland, 08.8, lip, oral cavity, and pharynx. C14.8, rectum, anus, and anal canal. C21.8, biliary tract. C24.8, digestive system. C26.8, female genital organs. C57.8, male genital organs. C63.8. All these are codes that are used when the tumor is overlapping 2 sites or 2 subsites, and there's no way of telling that, okay, this tumor definitely started here. It's just overlapping 2 sites. We always use 0.8 to code. So the implied rule is if you cannot tell where a single tumor started in an organ or system, you use the overlapping site code, which would be C, whatever, 0.8. And it's always important to remember it does not apply to non-adjacent sites. For example, if you have a squamous cell carcinoma of the skin of the forehead and the skin of the forearm, they are not adjacent, so you have to code it to 0.9, right? And it does not apply to separate lesions, such as separate tumors in the upper inner and lower outer quadrants of the breast. Primary site would be C59 because the tumors are not overlapping. There are 2 separate tumors in the breast. And rule D, which is coding lymphoma sites. You code lymphomas arising in the lymph nodes to C77, right? And if multiple lymph node regions are involved, you're coding to 0.8. In this case, it does not matter if the lymph nodes are of adjacent region. Once there are multiple lymph node regions involved, you're coding to 0.8. If no site is indicated for a nodal lymphoma, you code to 77.9, as in you just see that it's a lymphoma with no specifics as to where which lymph nodes it arose from, you're coding to C77.9. You're coding extranodal lymphomas to the site of origin, which may not be the site of biopsy, right? And if no site is indicated for a lymphoma and it is suspected to be extranodal, code to C80.9, which is an unknown primary site, because you don't know which site it arose from. So you're coding to C77 unless it's stated to be an extranodal or extralymphatic site. Extranodal lymphatic tissues, example, spleen, the thymus, tonsils, Peyer's patches, lymphoid nodules of the appendix, and Walde's ring. Lymphomas occurring in specific organs are called extralymphatic and should be coded to that organ of origin. Stomach, small intestine, large intestine, brain, and breast. Right? So we're coding to the lymph nodes unless it's an extranodal or extralymphatic site. In that case, you basically have to code them to the site of origin. And the special rule that is involved in this, in Rule D, is, once again, as I mentioned a little bit, C77.8, where involved lymph node change do not have to be adjacent for you to code it to 0.8. Once there are 2 or more lymph node chains involved, you code to 0.8 unless they occur in the same region. So we would see here for the peri-auricular and occipital nodes, they both occur in the head and neck region. So this code is 77.0. But for the others, we see we code to 0.8 because they exist in different regions, and it doesn't matter whether or not they're adjacent, we code into 0.8. So these are the examples I have for Rule D. Hodgkin lymphoma of the cervical lymph nodes, C77.0. Malt lymphoma of the stomach, we code into the site of origin, which is the stomach, C69. B-cell lymphoma of the iliac and femoral nodes, special rule, C77.8. It doesn't matter if they are adjacent. Once the more than one lymph node chain are involved, we do use the 0.8. And once again, primary lymphoma of the femur, we code into the site of origin, which is the bone, right? And the summary of this rule is that you're coding a lymphoma to its site of origin. All right. We have any more questions? Hope that helped.
Yes, thank you very much for the recap. Are there any other questions? Nothing came in the Q&A.
Okay.
Or in the chat.
Well, we've come to the end of the presentation. Next week, we will continue with the second half of this presentation, which would look at the morphology part and the morphology, behavior, and grade part of the ICD-10 code. Okay,
so I'd just like to thank Casey for reviewing this with us this morning. And thank you everybody who attended and who participated. We hope it was useful. If you have any questions, please feel free to email myself. I believe, I'm just going to put my email in the chat in case you don't have it. But I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you have any follow-up queries, please send me an email and I'll be happy to follow up with you on that. Okay, otherwise we will see you back here next week, Wednesday morning. Thanks again and have a great day.
Okay, thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.